Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
From them, the blood of human sacrifice must come. From them, the blood of expiation.
The New Old House, submitted by Garrett. When Kara and I bought this house in the summer of 2002, we were 23 years old and had only been out of college for a few months. We weren't married yet, and I had some money from an inheritance. My father had passed away and left me a good sum of money. This was going to be our first house and what we thought was the start of an excellent future. We'd both grown up in Kansas, but we'd spent the previous 4 years in another part of the state going to school. We were super excited to have a place of our own after living with roommates for 4 years. This house was about 20 minutes outside the nearest city, sitting on several acres of flat open land with a weathered barn behind it. It wasn't an especially old house, at least not by Kansas standards. It had been built sometime in the early 1900s and added on to more than once, but it had been vacant for nearly a year when we bought it. The price was right. We knew there had to be a reason, though, because it did seem to be on the low end. At the time, we just assumed it was simply that nobody wanted to put the work into an old country house. So in we moved with our meager belongings. The first few weeks were completely normal. We were just busy stripping wallpaper, replacing sections of flooring, and painting rooms and hauling trash out of the barn. At night, we'd sit on the back porch with a couple of beers and talk about how lucky we felt. We did have plans to get married, and that was also on our mind. Then the house started to make noises, but nothing super unusual. Old pipes knocking and floorboards creaking. The wind pushed against the siding, and we heard mice in the walls. And then one night, I woke up because I heard something scrape across the kitchen floor. This took me a little aback. It literally sounded like someone dragging something across the floor. I didn't wake up Kara. I just lay there listening, and I heard it again. I got out of bed and walked down the hallway, and unbeknownst to me, Kara had woken up and was following me. She bumped into me, and I nearly shit my pants, but that's when we just stood at the kitchen entrance together and looked inside. One of the dining chairs we had was sitting several feet away from our little kitchen table. I was certain I'd left it pushed underneath there before going to bed, and Kara thought maybe we'd just forgotten. But neither of us gave it much more thought, chalked it up to just the way it was, and went back to bed. 2 nights later, the same chair was back in the middle of the kitchen. And after that, things began moving more often. I had this small table in the living room, and it would sometimes be several feet from where I'd left it. Kitchen chairs would be turned around or pushed against the walls, and once I came home from work and found every chair in the dining room pulled away from the table they were at and facing the hallway. Kara hadn't done it. She was upstairs when I arrived home and told me that she hadn't been downstairs all afternoon as she was busy doing things upstairs. We started putting things back where they belonged without discussing it much. We didn't want to admit that it bothered us. Then, one night, I was sitting on the couch reading when the coffee table moved. This didn't tip, and it didn't rock. It moved. I saw it. The entire table slid approximately 3 feet across the hardwood floors and then stopped. I could hear the legs scraping the boards, and I remember staring at it for several seconds before standing up. Kara was in the kitchen and came running when she heard me yell her name. We checked the floor, and we checked underneath the table, and hell, I even checked the walls and windows for some reason. There had to be an explanation, I thought. But that was the point where the house really changed. Over the next several months, the things moving around the house became a little more violent. Doors were slamming hard enough to shake the frames, and cabinets were opening by themselves. Objects started to disappear and then turn up in strange places, like something in my wife's vanity would suddenly show up in the garage. A framed photograph had been thrown from a shelf while Kara was standing less than 10 feet away, and it struck the wall hard enough to crack the frame and break the glass. One afternoon, I was repairing a section of drywall when I heard Kara screaming from the kitchen. I ran in and found her standing against the counter. A drinking glass had been thrown across the room and shattered against the wall beside her head. She hadn't touched it. A week later, something threw a ceramic bowl at me. I'd been walking through the hallway when it came from the dining room. I never even saw it leave the table, but I did see it in the air. It struck the wall next to me and broke into pieces. Throughout all of this, yes, we realized this was not normal, but we didn't know what to do. When we talked to our parents, they told us that we were probably just souping things up and it was just a house settling. But after that bowl and glass, that was the first time I genuinely considered leaving. We tried explaining everything away. We were stressed out. It was old wiring, uneven floors, animals in the walls. I mean, maybe we were moving things ourselves and forgetting. But again, there were those things that we couldn't explain, the glass and the bowl. One night, Kara and I were sitting together in the living room when a chair at the dining table began sliding backwards, and we both watched it. It moved slowly at first and then faster, scraping across the floor until it struck the wall. Neither of us spoke, and that's when another chair moved. It slid out from underneath the table and stopped in the center of the room, and at that point I just grabbed Kara. I grabbed my car keys and we left the house. I got in the car and started driving around and did so until morning. There was no way we wanted to go back there. But what I thought was bad was going to get worse. Eventually, it wasn't just objects. It was the appearances. The first time I saw one, I thought someone had broken into the house. I was standing at the bottom of the stairs when I saw what looked like a man standing at the far end of the hallway. He was tall and thin and dressed in dark clothing. His face was difficult to make out. I took a step towards him and he disappeared. And I checked every room. No one was there. Kara eventually saw him too, and she described him almost exactly the way I had. But then there were other figures after that. A woman standing near the kitchen doorway. A child sitting at the end of the hallway. Sometimes we'd catch these things only in our peripheral, and sometimes we'd see them clearly for a second before they disappeared. By the 8th month of us living there, the house felt hostile. We were afraid to sleep there. We were afraid to leave each other alone there, and we of course were afraid to be alone there. One night while we were in bed, something slammed against our bedroom door repeatedly. It wasn't knocking, it was something slamming. The door shook in its frame while we just sat against the headboard. Then the bedroom door suddenly flew open. There was nobody outside, but that was it. I finally contacted a reverend from a church we'd started attending, and we told him everything when he came out for coffee. He didn't laugh or tell us that we were imagining things, but he did ask us several questions. And then he walked through every room of the house with us and asked if he could bless it. And we agreed. He spent nearly 2 hours inside with us that afternoon. He prayed in every room, including the basement, attic, and the barn. Nothing crazy happened while he was there. And before leaving, he told us he couldn't promise what would happen afterward. But he did believe in his Lord and Savior that we had done the right thing. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. A week passed, then a month. Nothing happened. The chairs stayed where we put them, and the doors stopped slamming. We never saw another ghostly figure, and eventually our fear faded enough that we began enjoying the house again. About a year after the Reverend came, I was clearing brush behind the barn, and I decided to turn part of the land into a garden. While cutting through a dense patch of weeds and young trees, I uncovered several pieces of old stone, and at first I thought they were pieces of fence posts. That's when I realized they were headstones. There were 8 or 9 of them, scattered beneath the brush, and they were handmade and badly weathered. Some had names carved into them, but the letters were so faint that I had to actually kneel down to read them. I didn't recognize any of the names, and the dates were very old from what I could make out. I asked a few people in town about the property and mentioned the graveyard, but nobody seemed to know anything. An older man that we talked to at town hall said he'd never heard of a cemetery being out there, and another said that there had been several farms in that area generations ago, but he couldn't remember any family cemetery. I went home that evening feeling unsettled, and Kara and I talked about it over dinner, but neither of us could figure out what it meant. That night we left the windows open. It was a nice warm spring evening, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. No rain, no thunder, and the air had been completely still all afternoon. We were sitting in the living room when it happened. This tremendous rush of wind came from the backyard. It came through the open windows with such a force that the curtains snapped straight toward the ceiling and papers flew up from our table. Curtains whipped wildly into the hallway, but the strangest part wasn't that the wind didn't behave like ordinary wind. It came from the direction of the graveyard. It rushed through the back of the house and passed directly through the living room where Kara and I were sitting, went down the hallway, and then burst through the open window at the front of the house. The entire thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then everything became perfectly still. Kara just looked at me and I looked at her, neither of us saying a word. We didn't really need to. After that night, nothing ever happened again. Not one chair moved, not one door slammed. We never saw any other creepy figures and never had any other unexplained sounds. I still think about those graves sometimes. I think about the names we couldn't read and the people in town who had no memory of the family that had once lived and died on that land. And I think about that wind, because whatever had been inside our house for those first 8 months had been gone for almost a year. When I finally uncovered those forgotten graves, something came through the house from that direction. I am sure of it, and I know it came from the backyard. I haven't been able to convince myself that it was only the wind. Insane Neighbor, submitted by Jeanette. When Scott and I moved into our house, the man living next door, Ray, was one of the first people to introduce himself. He came over with a smile and shook Scott's hand and told us that he'd lived in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. He seemed friendly and even offered to help us if we needed anything. For the first few weeks, we thought we'd gotten lucky with our neighbors. That changed gradually, and Ray started making suggestions about our property. At first, they were harmless, like he told us where we should put our trash cans and which day we should mow, but the suggestions became demands. He complained about where Scott parked his truck and how long we left our porch light on at night, even what time our daughter came home from school. Whenever Scott told him that we'd handle our own properly, politely I'll say, Ray would smile and say, "Just trying to keep this neighborhood nice." But eventually, he stopped smiling. He became a dick. He began telling other neighbors what they could and couldn't do. He complained about everyone, their fences, their flowers, their outdoor decorations, even sometimes kids who just left stuff in their front yard. With us, though, he seemed especially focused. One afternoon, Scott came inside shaking his head after Ray had spent 20 minutes lecturing him about a section of grass that supposedly wasn't being cut correctly. But the biggest blowout came when we decided to paint our house. We picked a color we loved, and we hired a local company to do the job. Ray came over while they were preparing the house and told us that we weren't allowed to paint it that color. I kind of laughed in his face because I thought it was a joke. But he wasn't joking. He said the color was wrong for this neighborhood and told us to choose something else. Scott calmly but firmly told him that, hey, this is our house and the work was starting the next morning whether he liked it or not. Ray stared back at my husband for several seconds before saying, "You're going to regret this, buddy boy." Well, that night, the workers' equipment was damaged. One of their ladders had been broken, another had been moved behind the shed, and several of their extension cords had been cut. Some of the paint supplies had been knocked over and spilled, and basically ruined. And of course, nobody had seen anything. But give me a break. There was no fucking question that someone had deliberately gone through this work area. My husband went over to confront Ray about it, but he didn't answer the door. The next night, something else happened, And finally, Scott waited outside. Around midnight, he saw Ray coming through our side gate. Scott immediately got in his face and told him to get the fuck off our property. Ray didn't apologize. Instead, he actually stepped up to Scott and began talking about our daughter. He told Scott that he should think carefully about how he treated him because bad things happen to kids when parents make enemies. Yeah, he actually said that. I wasn't outside, but Scott later told me that something inside him snapped. He punched Ray once, right in the chin, and Ray went down hard. When he got up, he ran back to his house, well, staggered, I guess, and called the police. When officers arrived, both Scott and Ray were detained while they sorted through what had happened. Ray kept insisting that my husband had attacked him for no reason, but the officers learned that Ray had entered our property repeatedly, and of course the damage to the workers' equipment and threats didn't look good for him. Ray was eventually arrested for trespassing, resisting an officer, and several other charges related to what had happened that night. My hubby didn't get off scot-free either, though. He did receive an appearance ticket for battery, but after everything was reviewed, the charge was ultimately thrown out of court. We haven't seen much of Ray, even though we know he still lives over there. He doesn't harass anybody too much, but does every once in a while raise his voice in contention about something happening in the neighborhood. We've gotten used to it. It's bothered me always, though, that he went from being such a friendly guy who welcomed us to someone who believed he had the right to control everything. And the fact that he was watching our house is still creeping me out. He probably still is, keeping track of our family and keeping track of things nobody has asked him to notice. Even after he was arrested, though, I couldn't stop wondering how long he'd been watching us before we even realized he was paying attention. Oh well, you buy a house, you don't get to buy your neighbors. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.